Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and discovering that your entire financial life has been carefully engineered. Not by accident, not by bad luck. Engineered, your paycheck, your debt, your rent, your subscriptions, your attention span, even the feeling that you're somehow behind no matter how hard you work. All connected. And the strange part is, the system doesn't actually require you to fail. It just requires you to stay slightly unstable. Because a person with breathing room is difficult to monetize. But a person living one emergency away from panic? That person becomes the perfect economic machine. Think about how absurd modern life has become. A country with more wealth than any civilization in human history somehow produced millions of people who are afraid to check their bank account before buying groceries. People with jobs. People with degrees. People doing everything they were told to do. And yet, the average worker feels financially exhausted in a way that previous generations rarely described. Not poor, that's different. Exhausted, like money disappears faster than reality can explain. And the official explanation is always strangely personal. You bought too much coffee, you should budget better, you need more discipline. Meanwhile, corporations spend billions studying human psychology with the intensity of a military operation. Apparently your oat milk latte is the real threat, right? Because if there's one thing standing between Wall Street and economic collapse, it's a 26-year-old buying guacamole. The truth is more uncomfortable. Modern consumer economies are no longer built around financially stable citizens. They're built around financially active citizens. There's a difference. A financially stable person saves carefully, spends selectively, avoids unnecessary debt, and delays gratification. A financially active person constantly transacts, clicks, subscribes, borrows, upgrades, finances, consumes. One creates stability, the other creates GDP. And somewhere along the way, the economy quietly changed what kind of citizen it rewarded. It used to reward financially stable people, people who saved money, bought homes, built long-term security. Now it increasingly rewards financially active people, people constantly clicking, subscribing, borrowing, upgrading, financing, consuming. Because stable people are economically quiet. They don't pay much interest. They don't impulse buy every upgrade. They don't generate endless streams of behavioral data. The modern system doesn't necessarily want you bankrupt. Bankrupt people stop paying. But it doesn't want you fully stable either. It wants you active, continuously transacting, continuously engaged, continuously exhausted enough to keep chasing the next financial solution. And over the last 50 years, the American economy quietly shifted from rewarding the first type of person to extracting maximum value from the second. To understand how this happened, you have to go backward, not to ancient history, just far enough back to a time when the relationship between work and survival still made intuitive sense. After World War II, the United States entered one of the greatest economic expansions ever recorded. Factories exploded with production. Suburbs expanded across the country. Household incomes rose rapidly. And for a brief moment in modern history, ordinary workers shared directly in national prosperity. Between 1945 and the early 1970s, wages and productivity moved together almost perfectly. That's important, because productivity is really just a fancy way of asking a simple question. How much value does the average worker create? And during that era, when workers produced more, they earned more, simple. A factory worker could support an entire family. One income could buy a home, raise children, pay for college, take vacations, retire. Not because people were magically smarter with money, because mathematically, life costs less relative to income. That distinction matters. There's a tendency to romanticize older generations as uniquely disciplined. But discipline becomes easier when housing costs 3 times your annual salary instead of 12. The average home in America in 1970 cost roughly 3 to 4 times the median yearly income. Today, in many cities, it's 10 to 15 times. That changes everything. And somewhere around the early 1970s, the economic relationship underneath American life quietly fractured. Productivity kept climbing. Worker pay didn't. The famous graph looks almost fake when you first see it. For decades, the lines move together. Then suddenly, they separate. One continues upward, the other flattens. And the gap keeps widening year after year. That gap represents trillions of dollars in economic value created by workers but redirected elsewhere, mostly toward capital, corporate profits, financial assets, executive compensation, shareholders. The economy kept growing, but the average worker stopped meaningfully participating in that growth. Now here's where the story gets interesting, because corporations immediately encountered a problem. If wages stagnate, who buys everything? Consumer economies require consumers. You can't endlessly sell bigger houses, better cars, upgraded appliances, luxury electronics, and premium lifestyles to people whose purchasing power stopped rising. At least not directly. So the economy evolved a workaround: debt. Not debt as an emergency tool anymore, debt as infrastructure. That's the real shift most people never fully noticed. Debt became the bridge between wages that barely moved and a cost of living that kept accelerating. The American middle class increasingly stopped purchasing lifestyles outright and started financing access to them. Homes financed, cars financed, phones financed, education financed, furniture financed, even groceries financed now. We aren't just building wealth anymore. In many cases, we are servicing the bridge itself. The transformation happened gradually enough that most people barely noticed. Credit cards expanded aggressively during the late 20th century. Student loans exploded. Auto loans lengthened. Mortgages became increasingly financialized. The system discovered something extraordinarily profitable. A stagnant paycheck could still support rising consumption, if consumers borrowed the difference. And once borrowing became normalized, the economy no longer depended on rising wages the way it once had. It depended on expanding credit. That sounds abstract until you realize how much modern life depends on financing. Cars, phones, furniture, education, medical procedures, vacations, even groceries now. Buy now, pay later. 3 words that perfectly summarize modern consumer capitalism. What's fascinating is how quickly borrowing stopped feeling like borrowing. Previous generations often viewed debt as dangerous, embarrassing even. Modern culture reframed debt as convenience, flexible payments, smart financing, zero-down ownership. Language matters, because psychologically humans respond differently to monthly payment than total cost. A $70,000 truck sounds expensive. Only $740 per month sounds manageable. The financial industry understands this extremely well. In fact, one of the most powerful forces in modern economics is something called payment abstraction. The further spending moves away from physical pain, the easier it becomes. Cash hurts, you feel money leaving, cards hurt less. Autopay barely registers at all. Digital transactions transformed spending into something almost invisible. And invisible systems are extraordinarily powerful because the brain stops tracking them carefully. This is one reason subscription businesses became so dominant. Not because consumers consciously wanted dozens of recurring charges, but because recurring charges exploit cognitive blindness. Most people dramatically underestimate their monthly subscriptions. Streaming, cloud storage, premium apps, delivery services, gaming memberships, fitness platforms, software bundles. Individually, they feel small. Collectively, they quietly consume thousands of dollars per year. And businesses love subscriptions because subscriptions convert unpredictable human behavior into predictable corporate revenue. Wall Street adores predictability. A company selling products hopes customers return. A subscription company charges customers automatically whether they think about the product or not. There's a reason nearly every industry now tries to transform itself into a subscription model, even cars. Some manufacturers experimented with charging monthly fees to unlock heated seats already installed inside the vehicle, which sounds like satire, until you realize it was real. The future increasingly resembles a world where ownership itself becomes temporary. You don't fully own software, you license it. You don't permanently buy entertainment. You stream access. You don't purchase products. You finance experiences. And every recurring payment slowly reduces financial flexibility. That matters because flexibility is what separates inconvenience from crisis. A financially fragile household isn't necessarily one earning low income. It's often one where nearly every future dollar is already promised away. Rent, insurance, subscriptions, debt payments, car loans, minimum balances. By the time income arrives, most of it already belongs to someone else. And this creates a strange illusion. Modern consumers often feel wealthier than they actually are because access to products became easier while ownership became thinner. You can live inside an expensive apartment, drive an expensive car, carry expensive technology, wear expensive brands, and still secretly have almost no net worth. Because visible lifestyle and actual financial stability are no longer the same thing. Social media amplified this dramatically. Before the internet, people mostly compared themselves to neighbors, coworkers, friends. Now they compare themselves to algorithmically selected highlight reels from millions of strangers, which would already distort reality. Except the platforms themselves optimize for envy. That's the uncomfortable part. Content that triggers aspiration performs better. Luxury lifestyles, extreme beauty, exotic vacations, status symbols. The algorithm isn't necessarily trying to make people unhappy, but it is trying to maximize engagement. An emotionally charged comparison happens to be extremely engaging. This matters economically because dissatisfaction fuels consumption. If people felt genuinely content with what they already had, entire industries would collapse overnight. Fashion relies on perceived inadequacy. Luxury branding relies on status anxiety. Influencer culture monetizes aspiration directly. Edward Bernays understood this almost a century ago. The nephew of Sigmund Freud realized products become vastly more powerful when attached to identity. Don't sell cigarettes. Sell freedom. Don't sell watches. Sell success. Don't sell cars. Sell status. Modern advertising evolved into a sophisticated system for converting emotional insecurity into economic activity. And today, artificial intelligence supercharges that process. Platforms study what you pause on, what you click, what keeps your attention, what triggers emotional reactions. Then they refine the feed accordingly. The result is a personalized psychological environment optimized for consumption. Not necessarily because anyone planned a grand conspiracy, more because every incentive naturally evolved in the same direction. Attention became profitable, and profitable systems tend to expand until something stops them. Now combine all of this: stagnant wages, easy debt, subscription extraction, algorithmic desire, exploding housing costs, healthcare inflation, tuition inflation. Suddenly, modern financial stress starts making mathematical sense. Consider housing alone. For many Americans, rent now consumes 30 to 50% of take-home pay. That's before groceries, before transportation, before insurance, before debt, which means millions of people are operating with almost no margin for error. And margin is everything. The difference between stability and panic is often shock absorption. Can your system survive unexpected pressure? A car repair, a medical bill, job loss, a rent increase. We discovered during recent economic shocks just how fragile many households actually were. Because despite living inside the richest economy ever created, enormous numbers of people lacked even a few weeks of financial resilience. And again, the official explanation remained oddly moralistic. People just need better budgeting. But budgeting cannot fully solve structural arithmetic. If essential costs rise dramatically faster than income for decades, eventually households compensate somehow, usually through debt, or delayed milestones, or exhaustion, sometimes all three. This is where modern economics becomes psychologically strange, because the economy can appear healthy statistically, while citizens feel increasingly unstable personally. Stock markets rise, GDP grows, corporate profits surge. Yet ordinary people feel poorer. How is that possible? Because aggregate wealth and distributed wealth are completely different realities. If most gains flow toward assets primarily owned by the wealthy, national prosperity can increase while broad financial security declines. And asset ownership matters enormously. The wealthy don't primarily survive on wages, they survive on ownership. Stocks, real estate, businesses, capital gains. Meanwhile, most workers depend almost entirely on labor income. So when asset prices explode upward while wages stagnate, inequality accelerates naturally. And ironically, rising inequality often creates even more pressure for visible consumption. Economists sometimes call this expenditure cascades. As luxury standards rise among higher income groups, middle income groups stretch financially to imitate them. Not because people are irrational, because humans are social creatures. Status has always mattered. The modern economy simply industrialized status competition, and technology made comparison constant. Now here's the truly bizarre part. Many systems that financially pressure consumers also depend on consumers continuing to spend aggressively. That creates a dangerous balancing act. The economy needs households healthy enough to keep consuming, but not necessarily healthy enough to stop needing the system. Think about credit cards. The ideal customer isn't someone completely bankrupt. That customer stops paying. The ideal customer is someone permanently carrying manageable debt. Someone continuously paying interest, not collapsing, not escaping, just orbiting. That's the perfect word for it. Orbit. The banks don't actually want most people financially destroyed. Destroyed customers stop paying. But they also don't necessarily want customers completely debt-free and independent either. The perfect customer lives in controlled instability, stable enough to keep making monthly payments, unstable enough to never fully eliminate the principal, always circling the balance, always paying interest, always one disruption away from needing the system again, not rich, not ruined, just economically suspended in motion. And that same logic quietly appears across the economy. Streaming companies want endless monthly retention. Luxury brands want recurring aspiration. Social platforms want continuous attention. Financial institutions want long-duration borrowing. The incentives align around sustained dependence, which explains why modern life often feels strangely exhausting, even when technology supposedly made everything more efficient. Efficiency gains didn't always translate into more freedom. Sometimes they translated into higher expectations. You can now answer emails instantly. So employers expect instant availability. You can order products instantly. So spending becomes frictionless. You can access endless entertainment. So attention fragments continuously. Technology solved certain problems while intensifying others. And increasingly, time itself feels monetized. Every notification competes for attention. Every platform competes for engagement. Every company competes for recurring revenue. Human focus became infrastructure. Which brings us to a deeply uncomfortable question. What exactly is the endpoint of all this? Because systems built around perpetual consumption eventually encounter limits. Debt has limits. Attention has limits. Emotional exhaustion has limits. At some point, households simply cannot absorb additional pressure. And signs of strain already appear everywhere. Falling birth rates, delayed home ownership, rising anxiety, financial burnout. Young adults increasingly describe major life milestones almost like luxury purchases. Children, homes, retirement. Things once considered ordinary parts of adulthood now feel financially intimidating. And this creates a generational tension that's easy to misunderstand. Older generations sometimes interpret younger generations as irresponsible. Younger generations often interpret older generations as oblivious. In reality, both groups experienced fundamentally different economic environments. A house purchased decades ago for 3 times annual income behaves very differently from one purchased today for 12 times annual income. Those are not minor adjustments. Those are entirely different financial universes, which is why conversations about money increasingly feel emotionally charged. Because underneath budgeting debates are deeper questions about fairness, security, and the future itself. People can tolerate hardship surprisingly well when they believe stability remains achievable. What destabilizes societies psychologically is the feeling that the latter itself is disappearing. And yet the modern economy continues accelerating. Artificial intelligence threatens labor disruption. Housing shortages continue. Healthcare costs remain extreme. Consumer tracking becomes more sophisticated. At the same time, enormous wealth continues concentrating into fewer hands. The top percentages of society own massive shares of financial assets. And because asset ownership compounds over time, wealth concentration tends to reinforce itself. Money generates more money. Meanwhile, wages rarely compound the same way. This is why some economists argue the modern economy increasingly rewards ownership over labor. And if that trend continues long enough, traditional upward mobility becomes harder for ordinary workers to achieve. Not impossible, harder. That distinction matters, because exceptional success stories will always exist, but systems should be judged by typical outcomes, not extraordinary ones. And today, many ordinary people feel trapped inside a treadmill where productivity rises, technology advances, corporations grow, markets expand, and yet personal stability feels permanently out of reach. So where does that leave everyone? Probably not where internet gurus claim. There is no magical budgeting hack that fixes structural housing inflation. No side hustle that automatically solves systemic wage stagnation. No minimalist documentary capable of reversing 40 years of economic incentives. But understanding the system changes the way you interact with it, because invisible systems are most powerful when mistaken for personal failure. Once you recognize the mechanisms, certain illusions become harder to maintain. You start noticing how aggressively modern life pushes constant consumption. You notice how often convenience quietly becomes dependency. You notice how much of the economy profits from financial instability without allowing total collapse. And maybe most importantly, you notice how carefully modern culture confuses visible wealth with actual security. A financed lifestyle can look impressive right up until the moment income stops. Real financial resilience is usually quieter, less performative, more boring, which is probably why social media rarely celebrates it. Nobody goes viral for maintaining emergency savings. Nobody builds an influencer empire around moderate expectations and low fixed expenses. But historically, resilience matters far more than appearances during periods of economic uncertainty. And uncertainty appears to be increasing, not decreasing. The strange irony is that modern economies became incredibly advanced at producing comfort, convenience, and entertainment, while simultaneously generating extraordinary levels of financial anxiety. A civilization capable of same-day delivery somehow created millions of citizens terrified of unexpected medical bills. That contradiction feels important, because beneath all the graphs and statistics sits a larger philosophical question. What is an economy actually supposed to do? Is it merely supposed to maximize output? Maximize markets? Maximize shareholder returns? Or is it supposed to create durable stability for the people living inside it? Those goals overlap sometimes, but not always. And for the last several decades, the gap between them appears to be widening. Which brings us back to the beginning. Maybe the defining feature of modern financial life isn't poverty, it's controlled instability. Enough pressure to keep people producing, enough aspiration to keep people consuming, enough debt to keep people working, but not enough security for people to fully step outside the cycle. And if that's true, then the most important question isn't whether the system is broken. It's whether the system is doing exactly what it was built to do.